Okay, hello and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Christopher Van Doom. I'm a Senior Research Fellow with the Africa Programme at Chatham House. We're absolutely delighted to be once again partnering with the government of Slovenia on this conference, and we've been incredibly impressed not only with this conference, but how each one, it seems year on year, seems to feed into the next one, and I think it demonstrates that there's some real clear thinking going on here, which we are delighted to be a part of. My colleagues have a nasty habit of always making me chair the session that comes after the lunch. So I'm going to try and keep this at a good pace so that we all retain our attention. So thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to be welcomed on the panel by Professor Chukwumarije Okereke, who is the Director for the Center of Climate Change and Development at the Alex Ekwumeni Federal University in Ndufu Eliki. He's also a visiting professor at the University of Reading and Oxford. I'm delighted to have him here with us today. Also like to welcome Ms. Tina Kobelsek, who is the lead negotiator for climate change and the head of the delegation to the UNFCCC for the Ministry of the Environment and Spatial Planning for the Republic of Slovenia. Thank you for joining us. You're most welcome. We are joined by one person online, and that is Dr. Omnia El-Omrani, who is the youth envoy to the COP27 presidency. Omrani is only with us for the first half hour. So Omrani, we can see you on our screens. Thank you for joining us, and I'll try and make sure that you have plenty of time before you need to rush off. I'm also joined by Ms. Elizabeth Hege, who's the Senior Research Fellow for Governance and Financing for Sustainable Development at the Institute for Development and Sustainable International Relations. And finally, Mr. Usmani Fulsa, who's the coordinator for West African Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance, who I'm delighted to be able to welcome and join us on this panel. I know he was supposed to be on a different panel, but we poached him because we thought, no, we want you here. So I've grabbed him for this one, and we're very lucky to have you, particularly to talk about climate finance, given how many times it's come up in the sessions so far. So we do only have an hour before we break, so I want to jump straight into it. You can find more about our speakers in your conference packs with their bios and everything there. So our session this afternoon is looking at COP28 and looking at the COP processes in general. And how we deliver effective multilateral action. This is incredibly key for us here today, and I think particularly on the issue of political will, which is going to come through quite strongly in some of the answers. I'd like to invite Professor Chucks first to kick us off and answer a question on what was really achieved at COP27. And what are the priorities for COP28? Given the multiple issues, what are the key points that you think are achievable for African leaders and the African AGN? And there's an implicit question there around whether or not you think the AGN and African leaders are aligned, but I'll let you figure that one. Please.
Thank you very much, Chris. Since this is my first intervention, let me take this opportunity to say a big thank you to the government of Slovenia for the invitation. Going into COP27, there were strong mixed feelings as to whether much can be achieved from it. In particular because it was happening at a time when the world was facing the war in Ukraine with significant implications on food security. It was happening not long after COVID, and there were also significant issues related to the ability of the Egyptian government to host the world. And so it is with delight that those of us that have Africa as our primary constituency note the huge attendance of various world leaders in COP, around about 112. Some reports actually suggest that COP27 is the second highest attended COP in history. So even at that level, I think it was a big success for Africa. In preparation for the COP, the Egyptian government said that they wanted COP27 to be a COP for implementation. Of course, there are serious questions around that, given that COP is mainly a process-based event. But I think the idea was that having concluded the rules in the Paris Agreement in Glasgow, and given the IPCC report, which was released before the COP, that there was a need to now focus energy on implementing action on the ground. And so for Africa, this implementation translates into at least 3 key areas. The number one is implementing the NDCs that have been written by many African countries. Number 2 was significantly scaling up implementation on adaptation. And number 3 was the loss and damage issue. But underlying these 3 key areas is actually the issue of finance. And so one of the, and the issue of course, of climate security. So when we met in the African preparation before COP27, one of the key mantras was the need for Africa to secure a just outcome on the basis of climate justice in Egypt. So the key priorities for Africa was really doubling the finances going to adaptation. Some would say making adaptation to be at par with mitigation, securing finances to escalate action on the ground, and of course there was also the issue of the just energy transition. Many people will refer, of course, to the agreement. There was about 48 hours agenda fight on whether we could include adaptation finance, loss and damage finance into the agenda. This fight was won in favor of developing poor countries, including Africa. And so that's a triumph. And the expectations was far exceeded when not only that was included in the agenda, but actually it was agreed to set a loss and damage facility. So that is the biggest gain. The other priority which Africa is proud of is the multiple funding that was announced in order to help to scale up action on adaptation and, in some cases, energy transition in Africa. On the downside, there's a feeling that despite the implementation mantra, that there wasn't enough attention on mitigation, and particularly that the effort to bring pressure to bear, and in particular to talk about phasing out fossil fuel, didn't receive much attention. And so some people say that a lot of attention has been placed on loss and damage and adaptation, which is the consequences of mitigation, and not enough on the source of the problem, which is the pollution, the climate pollution in itself. Going to COP28, the CAHOX has indicated, and the AGN, that they will be seeking to bring their pressure to bear on the operationalization of the loss and damage facility. As you heard this morning, there are still quite a lot of questions on who is going to contribute what and how. The 100 billion climate finance goal was part of the priorities, and of course we are still not there. So expect a lot of emphasis on not only increasing finances within this pot of 100 billion, but also how do you actually operationalize and count. And a lot of emphasis on how to assess the finance, and you heard quite a lot of that this morning, will be part of the key. And then finally, for sake of time, there will also be a lot of emphasis on the just energy transition. Many African countries feel that we need to really define this and then have a conversation about the sort of packages that work for Africa. What worked in South Africa is great, but there is a sense that it will not work, at least in that kind of mode, for many other African countries, especially resource-rich Africa. Thank you.
Chuck, thank you very much. And yeah, on the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, maybe there are some South Africans in the room that might raise their hand later on and share some of their lessons for Nigeria, Senegal, and Egypt, who are also looking to have such partnerships. I'm going to go to Amrani online now. Thank you again for giving your time. I know that you're pressed for time, but what I want to hear from you is Chatham House was running a process looking at kind of the handover from COP26 to COP27, so from Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh. And in engaging various different African stakeholders throughout that process, one of the things that really came through was this sense that, well, African voices were well heard on the outside of the conference venue, but on the inside and on the negotiating table and in the rooms where it mattered, they weren't very well heard. And I think that this changed as we went through the Africa COP in Egypt, but perhaps less so for civil society. So what I want to ask you about is, what do you see as the priorities for ensuring that there is inclusiveness in multilateral climate negotiations, especially the COP process, and especially for young voices? Please, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. And this is what we recognized as the COP27 presidency, is that we see civil society as well as young people and experts as one of the key stakeholders and partners to the process, and we need to change the way that their perspectives, needs, and solutions are integrated, and how it can be done in a meaningful and transformative way. And that is why we decided for the first time to appoint a youth envoy, which basically a person within the presidency that links the perspectives and the needs and the ideas and the policy recommendations that young people have directly into the work of the presidency, which is responsible for facilitating the negotiation process, as well as organizing the different thematic days within the COP, and as well organizing and facilitating the participation of the different stakeholders, especially civil society and other actors such as young people. And upon my appointment, the very first task that I had is to listen and to consult the different youth-led organizations and groups as well as individuals and see what are the main challenges that they are facing in terms of their participation at COP, and how can the presidency work to address that in a way that is effective and in co-design with them. And the very first consultation that we did was actually during Africa Climate Week in Gabon. We had over 100 African youth come together, and we spoke about what can we do from now until COP27, but also do that in a way that is sustainable for the next COP presidencies to take on further, and to really prioritize the integration of the voices of the most impacted, the most vulnerable, who are always least represented and excluded from the process. And to do that further, every year for the past 17 years, a conference of youth is organized ahead of COP. And this year and every year, the conference produces a global youth statement, which is a set of policy recommendations where they deliver it to the presidency. And then we do not see any sustainable follow-up for that document, which has inputs from over 1,000, actually 30,000 young people online and 1,000 in person, feeding into what young people demand when it comes to adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, and climate finance. And we decided that this year in Egypt, we took the Global Youth Statement, we organized two roundtable discussions where we invited the negotiators, the ministers, and the chairs of the country groups together with the youth experts. We had one roundtable specifically focusing on adaptation and loss and damage and resilience, and another roundtable focusing on mitigation and just transition. And in these roundtables, the youth experts were given the floor first to share their demands and the evidence based on what they want to see, for example, with the loss and damage fund establishment, with the mitigation and just transition work program, with a global goal and adaptation. And then during these roundtables and this intergenerational co-creation of solutions, we took note of the outcomes, and then we worked together as the presidency to integrate them in the COP outcome decision, which is one thing that we felt as a way to really mandate the next presidencies to follow on these milestones and take on further the the roundtable discussions that were held, the appointment of a youth representative within the presidency, and also most importantly, which was one of the key highlights, is having a dedicated youth pavilion, a children and youth pavilion, which was an independently led space by young people for the young people, where we invited the key policy makers and the decision makers to come to that space and speak with young people and have these equal intergenerational dialogues together throughout the 2 weeks of COP. And this pavilion was done in the blue zone where the negotiations were taking place. But also, we had in the cover decision, which is very important to highlight, is recognizing the role of young people in the negotiation process. Many countries in Egypt had youth young negotiators. Over 55 countries had that. And it was a very meaningful way of translating the inputs from the grassroots youth who were working at the front line and bringing in their perspectives directly in the negotiation room, where countries were pushing for further, implementation of the NDCs, real implementation or facilitation of what the climate finance architecture is looking, and how we can further translate that to the communities who have that least access to it. And we're very proud to see that with the UAE presidency coming in and appointing a youth climate champion, who is Her Excellency the Minister of Community Development, and also having that conversations around dedicating that specific pavilion for children and youth coming in the conference, but also the efforts of bringing in over 100 young people from least developing countries and small state islands into COP, but also training them to understand and to participate in the negotiation process.
Omnia, thank you very much for that overview of what is being done by you, the team, particularly in the involvement of youth participation through those various initiatives and around COP. And perhaps just to follow on, just to ask for some specifics. I mean, we're here with a number of representatives from European countries. I mean, how useful or where's the success been in your role as the first ambassador in this position to be able to work with you, particularly in Europe, and what have you learned about the opportunity there for sharing perspectives from Egypt, from other African countries, and having input from youth in Europe as well? You know, what have you learned, and where's the success been there?
Yes, one of the key things that I saw was very inspiring in terms of really areas of collaboration when we look at specifically the COP process. For example, in the EU, many EU countries already have a very well-established program where they appoint youth delegates part of the official country delegations and the negotiators that go to COP. And there's an amazing network of youth negotiators within the EU, for example, coming from the Netherlands, from Sweden, Belgium, and Denmark as well. And we had several gatherings between the different young negotiators to understand how they established this program, how does it work, and then how can we take that to other countries in Africa and other regions to do that. But also in Africa, there are many good examples of where young people are appointed and integrated in the official country delegations. For example, in Kenya, in Morocco, they had 17 young negotiators coming in. And these lessons or best practice is so important because now we don't have a mapping of where countries empower youth to be part of the negotiations and decision making process, but also beyond COP, really co-creating climate policies for adaptation, for mitigation, and as the previous speaker said, looking at the implementation of the outcomes that are generated every COP. So these are areas I feel like young people coming from the EU and from Africa can work together, thinking about like strategizing towards important meetings like COP and really bringing in the policy recommendations together. So when we saw the loss and damage facility being established, there was a global consensus across all the different youth groups from all the different disciplines and geographies that they were coming together and demanding this fund to be established, and for many years before demanding the loss and damage agenda point to be seen and be part of the process. And now, with the facility being established, young people around the world, whether from Africa or the EU, are calling on this facility to be accessible for the grassroots communities and young people, and not to be just another inaccessible and difficult to access a fund, but for the loss and damage to really bring in the justice that young people are calling on, both the climate justice but also the intergenerational lens justice. One final thing I see as an opportunity of collaboration is capacity building, and also bringing in the frontline stories from Africa, from the EU, but also really having that knowledge sharing space for climate policies, for climate impacts, but also the co-benefits of working and on climate change, of investing in climate solutions for young people in Africa and in the EU.
Omnia, thank you very much for sharing your time and your thoughts with us today. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to Tina, and you have a difficult job in that we've heard from a number of your political leaders here this morning. And so it's time for you to now put some meat on the bones. And so within the parameters of what we're talking about in this session, perhaps you can talk through what are the specific ways in which Slovenia are including security issues in their preparation and points of concern for COP28? And given the relatively strict parameters and the process-driven approach of COP, what can be done to elevate these issues, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. Very happy to be here, part of this panel. I think we've already heard how important the climate agenda is, not only to Slovenia, but of course also wider, and how crowded, in a way, COPs are also becoming. And with this, I would like to highlight two different, basically, parts of the COPs, of the participation of Slovenia in this respect. I think as per COP, we have to look at the agenda as we have it in terms of the negotiation agenda, where we have a very clearly established agendas, which are in fact quite lengthy, and as was already mentioned, there is from time to time, or sometimes even more common, to have this sort of agenda fights before the negotiations in fact commence. And the agendas are clear. These are based on the convention, these are based on the Kyoto Protocol, these are based on the Paris Agreement. And there, of course, we have certain barriers, or we have the main topics selected, which is right now, in terms of the Paris Agreement, we know the three main goals. We have the mitigation, we have adaptation, we have finance. And of course, we are very happy to see that we are starting to look a bit broader, in a sense of, for example, creating the work program for just transition, as was mentioned, the mitigation work program, which we also hope that it will look much more into the different sectors and not only the emissions per general. And I think here we would like to see that, for example, the instruments like the cover decision is also perhaps used in a way where topics like water security, food security, and of course the climate security perhaps could also be further reflected. The cover decision, as we know, is a very strong yet very political instrument that we have, and I think in this respect, we see this as an opportunity for these issues. On the other hand, a very important part of the COP is this inclusion of the wider public, and as Omnia was mentioning, youth, and very encouraging to hear how UAE is including youth in the process as such. Also very happy to say that in Slovenia we are now setting up a program for our own youth delegate for the first time. So with all the rest that were mentioned already by the EU, we hope to have our own youth delegate for this year's COP as well, who would be part of our delegation. But in general, we know that COPs are, as already mentioned, getting bigger and bigger. And not only youth, but generally civil society, the amount of media that is there. It was mentioned Egypt was one of the bigger ones. I'm pretty sure UAE is going to make is gonna attract also lots of people who will travel to Dubai for the COP. And I think what should really be used is the fact that we have these thematic days, certain topics that are let's say highlighted around those days. And I think climate security once again is a very important element of these days. Perhaps connected to a few, and already in Egypt there was a great emphasis on food security, on water. I think there is an opportunity at COP28 to build on that, and of course Slovenia is very happy to continue working on that. So I leave it with this.
Tina, thank you very much. We'll come back to some of those issues in just a second. And I will take, after this first round of questions, I'll start taking questions from the audience as well, and we'll try and make this as participatory as possible. But before we do, Elizabeth, building on what we've heard this morning and what's just been raised, this morning we had this question of, is the EU listening? And looking at the barriers to EU-Africa engagement and how these can be addressed. We heard, again, through some of the work that we've been doing in the last 18 months, a familiar line starting to come through from some of the African stakeholders that we worked with of, well, if we're not being listened to, why do we turn up? And that kind of gave us a sense of the fragility of the political will around some of these multilateral engagements. So just want to ask you really, how do we retain that political will for multilateral processes, and where are the barriers to better EU-Africa climate negotiations?
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a very important issues, and I think at the COP21 and the Paris Agreement, one of the major innovations was that we had a universal agreement for the first time. And now and kind of like it was always a barrier in the climate governance, the north-south divide. And with the Paris Agreement, maybe we get the impression, or maybe even the illusion, that we kind of overcame this. And today, some of these questions are coming back, and I think they're coming back for good reasons, because we heard some of the commitments were not honored and so on. But I want to also specifically talk about the issue of just energy transition, where, especially in the Africa-EU relations, I think there's really a lot of potential to better listen to each other, or to come to better join the different narratives. And I think it will be also an issue that will come back at the COP28, because at the COP27, as Chuck said, there was a failure to have an ambitious text on all fossil fuels. And this is an issue I think that especially European countries will try to bring back also this year. But I think it's important to understand that also beyond the COP, this is an issue that has created a tension between the two continents. We also had the EU-AU summit in 2020 in February, where this question was quite divisive, the definition on how we define just energy transition, and especially around the question of financing gas. And they have found some compromise text at this summit, but it's not really clear for this. So there are compromise texts, but in the implementation, it's still quite stuck, and it's difficult to join these narratives. And also ahead of the COP27, there was actually an AU position on defining a just and affordable energy transition that uses renewable energy, but also all other energies, and which was not necessarily the view of all the African countries, and there were also some countries rejecting that, and especially the negotiators for climate. But I think it's important questions that are coming up, and I found it very eloquent this morning formulated by the ministers of Rwanda and Comor, that I think the heart of the question for African countries is legitimately how will we be able to industrialize while not using the fossil fuels, and if this is what we have to do, then please help us more and also show us that you can do it differently. And I think what happened since the war of Ukraine, I mean, there were positive developments in the EU, going for also more energy autonomy, also via expansion of renewables, more energy efficiency and so on, but also looking in the short term or medium term also for other gas sources or even coal. And I think this is something that has been very badly perceived by some African countries as like some kind of application of double standards and hypocrisy. And I think it's important that there is some kind of a joint narrative around just transition. It starts from the industrialization need of the African countries and integrates the green and the climate concerns.
Thank you very much. I think that the issue of define just in the just transition is going to keep people very occupied for a very long time. We'll come back to that. Usmani, thank you for joining us. Thank you. There's been a lot of discussion, or a lot of people have mentioned climate finance. Very little detail has been provided. So, what do you see as the positives on climate financing that came out of COP27, including on Article 6, loss and damage, but particularly the launch of the African Carbon Market Initiative? Are these success stories, and where are we going next?
Thank you, Chris, for giving me the floor. And first of all, as it is the first time I take the floor, I would like to thank the Republic of Slovenia and the Chatham House for inviting me to share our experience on behalf of the West African Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance. And as many speakers have already said this morning, climate change is a serious issue that we all have to deal with. And Africa is among the regions most vulnerable to climate change, and its countries with particularly low capacity to respond will be disproportionately impacted by the change it brings. This makes climate change mitigation a global imperative, and Africa is part of the solutions. That's why we all are engaged in implementing our national determined contributions, and we are doing quite a bit in our host countries. But the question that we Africans phase is now to manage and finance the economic transformation that will be required to curb greenhouse gas emissions and halt the destruction of our nature. African nations have been advocating for increased climate finance to adapt to climate change while meeting development goals. But you know, the 100 billion in annual climate financing that was pledged by developed countries since COP 2015 has yet to be met. Lower and middle income countries will need also additional 800 billion by 2025 and close to 2 trillion by year 2030 to avert the worst effect of climate change, and the energy sector alone will require something like 1 trillion of investment annually. So this is a very big amount of money that is required to address this issue of climate change. Thus, we think that to close the climate finance gap, African nations must seek opportunities, leverage the global carbon market to monetize the value of African ecosystem in storing and removing carbon. Because according to the Paris Agreement, in order to stay within the temperature limits set out in the Paris Agreement, developed countries in particular will have to significantly raise their ambitions in terms of climate change mitigation. International market-based cooperation and carbon markets can play a crucial role in that regard, enabling collective action that goes beyond current ambition level. And from COP27, one of the main positive outcome that I can highlight here is the finalization of the Article 6 rulebook that defined the guidelines, modalities, procedures for operationalizing Article 6. We do realize that there are some main challenges ahead in terms of operationalization of Article 6, but I will come later on that issues. But it's still an opportunity for us as African to take this opportunity to value the high potential that we have in terms of emission reduction or carbon sequestration. And positively, in COP27, we've seen that many initiatives have been taken by institutions, by countries, and one of them is the African Carbon Market Initiative, and we can also cite the US initiative, US Catalyst Initiative on Energy Transition, and also the UNFCCC Capacity Building Initiative to help countries, developing countries, in the readiness process for Article 6. That can be a good opportunity for African countries. For example, if I can take to the initiative of African Carbon Market Initiative, you mentioned earlier, it sets very ambitious targets for Africa. Produce 300 million carbon credits annually by 2030, and 1.5 billion credit annually by 2050. And the ambition also to unlock 6 billion in revenue by 2030 and over 120 billion by 2050. Support 3 billion jobs by 2030 and over 110 million jobs by 2050. And distribute revenue equitably and transparently with local communities. That are somehow the main objective that the African Carbon Market Initiative, launched by many entities, set as main target for our continent. But the question is, how will African nations operationalize a carbon market in a verifiable way which promotes carbon removal or the preservation of carbon sinks? How can a sustainable carbon market in Africa support the continent climate and development goal? Because before being able to take advantage of carbon markets, we need to be ready. We need to be ready at a technical level. We need to be ready at a political, regulatory level. We have to put some regulatory framework in our host country, and we need to be to have the capacity to develop good quality projects that can deliver good quality carbon credits and use this opportunity to mobilize carbon markets and additional financial flows for our continent. This requires a lot of capacity building. This requires a lot of technical support in terms of readiness for Article 6. And this requires also a lot of upfront financing, because when we talk about carbon markets, it's a result-based financing. So we need to implement the project first before being able to claim for carbon credits. So this needs a huge work that we have to do in terms of facilitating access to financing, mainly for the private sector. That will be the main actor operating on the ground, because they are the one who will be implementing concrete projects on the ground. So that's why I can say that in some part of some regions of Africa, in West Africa and in East Africa, we have been trying to create what we call the East African and the West African Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance, in order to better support our countries to take advantage of these existing opportunities relative to carbon markets, and to assist the country in the readiness process to put the appropriate institutional arrangement, the regulatory frameworks, and also the infrastructure that is needed to engage on carbon markets. And since 2017, we have been operating on the ground by some pilot activities, and I think we will be soon in a better position to take advantage of these existing opportunities in Africa. Our expectation for next COP 28 is to foster the readiness process that is ongoing in Africa, to make our countries more ready to tap in these existing financing opportunities and to start implementing concrete actions on the ground. We also expect to have more concrete mechanism for financing energy transition for African countries, where we have main priorities like energy access for all. That is some of the main issues that is many African countries or sub-Saharan African countries are facing as priority challenge in this region. We also will be working to have a fair price for carbon, because if you refer to the very important volume of carbon credit that can be generated in Africa, if you manage to have a fair carbon price that can be applied for credits, it would be a significant financial flows that can be bring to Africa, and that can help support the financing of our NDCs. For example, if you take the case of the voluntary carbon markets, I think that it could be a good opportunity to have some project, because considering the high potential that we have in terms of renewable energy project, in terms of nature-based solution project, we can mobilize important volume of financial flows for the financing of our NDCs, and also the contribution of the financing of adaptation. And the last but not least is to try to see how we can make the link between carbon markets and climate financing, because in Africa we have noticed that in the CDM era we have many CDM projects that cannot be, that was not sold in the market because of their size or because of the complexity of the methodology, or because of the situation of the market that was not attractive. Moving this project into climate financing can be a solution to mobilize additional resources to implement our NDCs. We've been trying to do this exercise in Senegal, and particularly in energy access, rural electrification. We manage, I used to work in the Senegalese Rural Electrification Agency. We used to develop a CDM program of activities, but unfortunately we could not have good price, we could not have an ERPA. And we managed to transform this CDM program as a GCF request that have been approved by the Green Climate Fund. And this financing is now helping us to give access to electricity to more than 1,000 villages in Senegal, and with a significant amount of $80 million in terms of financing. So this is significant, and it helped a lot in Senegalese government to reach their target of universal access to electricity in rural areas by 2030. So this is an example I wanted to share, and so far this is what we are doing in the region and our expectation for the next COP.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to the room for some questions just now, but I just, so do try and catch my eye if you want to raise a question, hold your pen up, or I've got one, I've got two. I'm just going to push a point here on where you say that there have been pilot activities undertaken. So I think a lot of what's come out from the Carbon Market Initiative and some of the figures that you've mentioned, they really spell out the incentives, and that incentive is jobs and available financing. And you've pointed at some of the constraints, regulatory constraints, capacity constraints, even things like how do you quantify some of this, and where's the statistical capacity, and where, you know, who holds that data on the ground, and so on, and all of these issues. So within those pilot activities, is there perhaps one or two kind of things that you can point to and say this was a key lesson that we learned here, and this is something that others need to take away?
Okay. In terms of piloting, we manage in Senegal, for example, to take the case of our agency for rural electrification. We tried to anticipate the adoption of the Article 6 in terms of regulatory framework, in terms of streamlining the process of project development. In partnership with the World Bank, we piloted what we call the standardized crediting framework. That is a locally, nationally managed framework for crediting. And through this process, we've been able to identify projects, to validate them, and to register nationally. And we've been able also to start organizing trainings for local validators, because in the CDM era, we face this problem relative to external validator or auditors coming from abroad, and with high costs, so that at the end of the day, transactions for carbon markets were very, very, very high, and this constituted a barrier for the development of carbon markets. By piloting this nationally managed framework for carbon crediting, made us aware of the challenge that we will have when we will fully operationalize Article 6 in terms of stakeholder consultation at a host country, in terms of regulatory framework to put in place, in terms to deliver the authorizations that are required, in terms of also accounting, because you need to have a national register, and you need to do some what we call corresponding adjustment in case you sell carbon credits, and you have to avoid double counting at an international level. All these issues that we've been trying to pilot make us aware of the huge challenge ahead in terms of capacity, in terms of governance, and in terms of upfront financing.
Lovely, thank you very much. So we'll go for the first question here, please.
Thank you. My name is Christina. I work in the German Foreign Office on climate and security. And I was very happy about this occasion. And thanks also for discussing your different perspectives. I think my question mainly goes to Tina, since the title of the debate was actually how to deliver effective action on climate security. And of course, you can argue that by improving climate finance, adaptation, especially mitigation, we will have climate security. But I think actually there's more to it. The debates that we had this morning also, climate security goes beyond these, let's say, typical UNFCCC questions. And since I've had some experience in COP negotiations myself, I always had the feeling that they are rather overloaded. I mean, we have so many topics, even getting our EU delegation together on all these different aspects. And then, you know, people coming and asking for a new subject like climate security. Can we really integrate it? I mean, we've been working on this for quite some time now. We've had great side events, but all this is kind of happening in the margins. And my question is that enough, or is there actually a way to integrate this aspect also as one to motivate negotiators even more, because it can have very positive like synergies that we could create with it. It could motivate them because of the relevance of the subject. It could make the political meaning of COPs even more relevant. Yeah, my question, how to integrate this practically in the next COP. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there was another question at the end of this table, and then I'll come to you. Yeah, so, and
Hi, my name is Lucia Corneluti, and I currently serve as one of the two first European delegations, youth delegates to the United Nations. And also during my last visit to New York, I got a chance to meet with the COP28 presidency, where we very thoroughly discussed also the youth participation and civil society participation. So the statement made by the youth envoy was very pleasant to hear on the concrete actions. Okay, where is the music come from? But today I really wanted to ask a question that I feel like it's sometimes overshadowed by these big COP questions or problems, and that is a direct connection between climate change and access to education. Because right now I think we all know that young people and children, especially young girls and women, are disproportionately affected by climate change in all views. Also when it comes to access to education, but this becomes even more apparent and more limited when it comes to countries that are already affected by the conflict. And my question would be, how can we make sure that the direct link between climate change and access to education, which are also arguably two of the most important SDGs that we have to make come true, how can we make sure that this is a bigger part in the COP28 conversations and also perhaps in negotiations?
thank you very much. And we'll go here and then there.
Hi, thanks so much to all the panelists. It was super interesting and very pragmatic. My name is Janani Vivekananda. I work for Adelphi, and I've been working with Christina and her colleagues at the German Federal Foreign Office on, amongst other things, a declaration supported by the G7 on climate, environment, peace and security. And the second point on this declaration, signed by the G7 and 20 other national governments, and probably a lot more now, is around mobilizing climate finance for peace. And this is something that came up at the end of the session that I was moderating this morning about how it's not always so negative, that there's actually an opportunity for climate financing to actually contribute to peace if it's done in the right way. My question to the panel is, how realistic do you think, given what Christina said about this burden, there's so much on the agenda, to ensure that climate finance, every single cent of climate financing, doesn't inadvertently contribute to conflict by being conflict blind, to ensure that the climate funds have a kind of conflict filter to ensure that they are peace positive? Thanks.
Thank you very much. And then
thank you, Chair. Just to spread it around your panel, maybe a slightly cheeky question. On the issue of carbon trading, given that Africa does have a substantive carbon asset, why have the discussions only been, or predominantly been, externally focused, and about bringing currency into the continent, rather than talking about the possibility of using the carbon asset to have more fossil fuel investment towards a net zero target?
Thank you very much. You'll get that one. So I think we'll start. So there was one directly for Tina around integrating climate security specifically into COP. Chuck's, I think, will give this question on climate and education, and also might have something to add on the issue of ensuring that climate financing isn't conflict blind. Elizabeth, I think, will give that question on the climate finance, not conflict blind, and particularly given your comments on the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. I mean, some of that funding is going into contexts which may not be. We'll do a second round. Some of that funding is coming into a situation which may not be necessarily classed as a conflict zone, but where there are very high levels of tension around some of these issues. And then we'll do the carbon trading. And if we keep our answers concise, we will have time for one more round of questions for those that still wish to participate. So Tina, first off, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I think you're very much right in saying how overloaded the agenda of the COP already is. And I think coming from a small country, having a very tiny delegation, normally attending COPs, we can of course fully understand how difficult it is actually to stretch over that many points that normally we would actually have to follow. I think when it comes to climate security in particular, my personal take would actually be to really try to connect it to many different aspects that are correlated to this in terms of also human security when it comes to food security, water security. So to basically link it with other elements that are already sort of slowly coming into the agenda. There is no such thing as an agenda point specifically on let's say, food security. But it is part of the conversations when it comes to AFOLU, when it comes to Koronivia. So there are some parts, and that's why also before, for example, I mentioned the Just Transition work program or the mitigation work program. There are some venues that I think we can explore, and we can further also develop this climate security aspect. And if I may just very quickly comment on the education part as well, because I think it is in fact very important, and also education has already been a part of the COP agenda itself. There is a program which is called the Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE, and it is part of this program is also education and basically developing, well, not only creating awareness, but in fact education when it comes to climate change and addressing climate change. And I think the participation of youth is in particular important when it comes to that particular agenda item. So there is already an agenda item when it comes to this, but I think it has to be, as already mentioned before with the climate security, actually further extended. And if I'm already speaking on the agendas, I think climate finance, on the other hand, is actually spilled over all the agenda items. Because obviously we are aware that there is no mitigation action, no adaptation action, we have loss and damage. All of those is connected to finance. So I think finance, of course, it is already prominently on the agenda. I think next year will be extremely important for finance in respect to the new collective quantified goal discussion. And yeah, I think of course also with the discussion of the loss and damage, it is an extremely big part of it. But yeah, to be short, I cut it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chuck, please.
Right. I was with the Minister for State for the Environment in COP26. I was preparing her for a different meeting. when a group of young people walked into her cabin and presented a paper. And the paper was a demand by the youth on some kind of, that the minister should commit Nigeria to a certain level of climate education back in the country. So as Tina said, this is kind of something that is already on the burner. We looked at it, and then, of course, I made my advice. She didn't sign because she didn't feel she had the mandate to sign. She needed to consult the president and stuff. But returning back to Nigeria, she has, on my advice and the advice of many others, really escalated action on climate education. Just before COP27, when we had this massive flood in Nigeria, many schools were shut. Children were out of school for many, many months. And if you look at the top part of Nigeria, the northern part, where you have huge desertification taking place, sacking many people from their home and sending them to the IDPs. These people don't have access to education for a considerable amount of time. So it's a very important issue. I myself, in the Center for Climate Change and Development, which I lead, have been doing quite a lot on this area. My team go to several schools to teach on climate education. We've developed a curriculum. We've taught the teachers. We plant orchards. And as I speak to you now, there is a big program that we are still doing on climate education in Nigeria. So I believe it's a very important, incredibly important topic, and I would encourage you to continue to pursue that. The relationship between conflict and finance is an interesting one. There are many examples I can give. In Brussels, a few months ago, we were talking to the vice president of the EIB, the European Investment Bank, and she was saying to me, we have money ready to go to Nigeria to develop one of the most technically feasible and cheap wind energy in Nigeria. But we can't go there because of conflict and insecurity. So we see also where a lot of conflict and insecurity is denying access to finance and investment on the ground. And then also we have the Great Green Wall project, which is supposed to go through about 11 African countries. We see some of those being compromised because of insecurity. On the other hand, we also see some of the project that's been successful being used as a haven. So we have climate finance going to a project, and the terrorists, if you like, using green, or some area that's supposed to be a green area, that have been financed because of through climate finance as a haven to launch the operation. So this is one great example where climate finance have been conflict blind. And then we see also the Acrisol project that has actually empowered one community over the other. So we didn't think through about the implications of this community receiving money, and the way that money was distributed actually made conflict worse in that area. So this is something I don't think that, of course, we can tackle in COP, but we need to really be sensitive. This is why it's important to think through this. We started to say, like, every ODI project needs to think about climate implications. And now we need also to be thinking about every finance, also ensuring that you have thought about the conflict implications of who is getting the money and how it's spent.
Thank you. Elizabeth, how to ensure climate finance is not conflict blind?
Yes, that's okay. That's very good, because I'm actually not an expert of conflict-sensitive finance, but maybe what I wanted to mention is maybe the COP is a bit crowded, but also the conversation that as COPs kickstarted was also the conversations on the reform of international finance institutions. And I think there are interesting milestones between now and the COP28, including the June summit in France on new global financial pact. And I think maybe that's also for you, the security or climate sensitive finance experts, may be interesting also to see how this can be linked to this international finance reform, institution reform agenda. I also maybe wanted to say on I think on the energy sector, we see that the war has already infiltrated the rhetorics of climate and energy, and especially in Europe. There's a French philosopher called Pierre Charbonnier who's coined the concept of écologie de la guerre, so the ecology of the war, that since the war, European countries or leaders also in the US has used also the rhetorics of the war to mobilize more for example, renewable energy and so on, and that can be a powerful driver, but it's also a rhetoric that is turned towards confrontation and not necessarily cooperation. So it's interesting because it really redefines. We're in a time where the political ecology is redefined by these new geopolitical realities, and it's not necessarily. It can be a powerful driver nationally, but it's not necessarily guaranteed that it will be a good driver for cooperation multilaterally. And maybe just to finish on, we mentioned the just energy transition partnerships. And I think what is interesting there, or what was interesting in the beginning when the first was concluded with South Africa at COP 26, was that there was this promise that there is something that is around a country-driven and country-defined plan, and also it's the country maybe who knows best its communities and also the conflict sensitivities and so on. And then there was also a promise at the EU summit that there will be other ZPs for Africa. We know that there are negotiations going on for Senegal, and we know that they are very complicated. And actually, they don't give me a lot of hope that there will be a lot of other African ZPs, but we'll see. So there's, and also even in South Africa, the way the ZP is now realized, it's not necessarily, this promise of very country-driven process is not necessarily what we're seeing in the end, where we still have quite a donor-driven agenda. But it's complicated, but I think it's an interesting innovation, and there are also interesting potentials around that.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to do another round, but there was one person. Do you want to say very briefly what your question was? Because I did miss you in the first round.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be very brief, and great panel. Thank you. My question was about the negotiation. It took almost 10 years to reach from the Basel Declaration to the sugarless brain. Come on, the Loss and Damage Fund. What will it take for multilateral agencies and countries to move the process faster and get to that just transition when we get it right? I mean, the definition of just transition. But what will it take, what do you think, for multilateral organization and countries?
Okay, thank you very much. We'll see if we've got time to answer that. We are overrunning, but we did start a little bit late. But very quickly, this answer to, should African countries who are well endowed with natural resources and so have a carbon deficit, if you will, should they be allowed to use their natural resources and their potential offsetting capacity to be able to say, no, we can develop fossil fuels and still be net zero?
Yes, it's this position can be understandable, rationally speaking. But here we do know that climate change is a global issue and is affecting everybody, and we need to have global action. For the time being, we do know that we are really late in taking action. And when we talk about net zero, I think I need to clarify, according to the Paris Agreement, net zero should be appreciated at a global level, but not at a region or at a host country level. Because currently we have some countries that are sinks already. So they are absorbing, but they are not emitting too much. So in the future, if they are already net zero, I can say, but if they are not making efforts to maintain this situation, they might be not in a reverse situation. But for me, I think it's more important to do the target setting at a host country in terms of contribution to net zero, taking into consideration your priority in terms of development, taking into consideration the trend of your emissions, and to see, realistically speaking, how this should be mitigated in terms of emission reduction. But we do know that in Africa we have carbon assets. We have the Basin of Congo. We have a lot of renewable energy. The main issue for us is to have a fair price for carbon, to value our carbon assets at a fair price, at a price that can help us finance our development needs in terms of energy access, sustainable energy access, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of research, and in terms also of technology transfer. I think this is how we should address this issue, but not considering the fact that we are really how can I say it? We are not emitting. We have the reservoir, and we are allowed to use this asset to fund our our fossil fuels. So I think at the end of the day, if we do the global assessment, we will end up in a more delicate situation. So I think we need to address this issue globally and try to see how best we can value our carbon asset in a fair manner that can be profitable for our economies, that can be profitable for our development trajectories. That's how I see this.
Thank you very much. I saw some shaking heads in the room there while you were answering that one. So we won't carry on with the debate, but there is definitely one in the room to be had. Not least to ask back, do countries who have preserved their natural resources but are importing their electricity from countries who are producing using coal fire? South Africa is the major contributor to the Southern African power pool. How do you balance those considerations? Yeah. So there's a lot more to be said on that. We are over time, but thank you all very much for your questions and for listening in on this panel. And thank you again for allowing us to have this opportunity to speak. So I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel and enjoy your free time, and hopefully see you on the tour later. Thank you.